and Jeet had many discussions on postcoloniality. So we used to take a lot of dig at Jeet. So still he has been kind enough to give another opportunity to come and meet all of you. So I wish this HCU academic the best, because these initiatives are very important because of the times we are passing through. These are extremely important initiatives, and uh, students are at the forefront of much of what's happening in the country in terms of resistance today. So thanks for also for forging such platforms for public discussions. So the theme I chose today, is close to a lot of work that I've been doing for many years now. Looking at the interface between, what is happening in terms of rise of Hindu nationalism in India and post-colonial theory. So what is the link between these two? That you have populist, right-wing, populist cultural politics that have come to the forefront, not only in India but globally we are witnessing this phenomenon. And preceding the right-wing, global right-wing rise in the last decade or so, 3 decades prior to that, we have had some kind of rise to the center stage of post-colonial theory, right, from Edward side onwards to Indian subaltern studies, Indian subaltern scholars, Dipesh Chakravarty, Partha Chatterjee, Ashish Nandi, Nicholas Dirks, some of these names. So both seem to emphasize certain cultural politics at the core, right? Both versions of Hindu nationalism as well as post-colonial theory have a critique of enlightenment, a critique of Eurocentrism, a critique of Western political theory, a critique that categories born in the West cannot be not suitable for the Indian reality. Both Hindu nationalists say this, like Home Minister Amit Shah said, human rights is an alien concept to India. Post-colonial scholars also make very similar argument. Constitution is a borrowed document. Rights, language don't belong to India. Hindu nationalists make a claim about centrality of community, culture. Hindu nationalists also are foregrounding categories of culture and community at the center. So there is some kind of a very strange bedfellows. Though one can argue that post-colonial theory has been, for the last 3 decades, a very subversive project. It is not a conservative project by any imagination, right? That it is subversive because it gave a call for subverting European enlightenment, and it is an invitation for us to think about questions of social change, questions of equality, dignity, recognition outside enlightenment categories. That is at the heart of post-colonial theory, which can be a fairly liberating project. That they are questioning the part dependency of European change, the transition debate from feudalism to capitalism, for instance. Ranajit Guha questions that why should globally all nations follow the same trajectory? Why can we not imagine that some trajectories can be very different between feudalism and capitalism? Nations can take very different historical trajectories. They don't have to end up with only capitalism, and that capitalism does not have to devour community, collective modes of thinking. So, uh, so that invitation, I think, is a very subversive invitation. That's an invitation for us to think of colonialism as leaving. That's why it's post-colonial. Post-colonial does not mean that that colonialism has ended, but the continuation of colonialism in post-colonial period, in post-independent period. Once independence nations gain independence, colonialism continues as an epistemic frame that we might have been liberated politically from colonial rule, but our epistemic modes of thinking or conceptual categories continue to remain colonial. That is why it is post-colonial, is about deconstructing the existing colonial thinking in independent sovereign nations. That is at the heart of the project. And it further assumes that much of this colonial thinking does not belong culturally, does not belong in terms of its life world to this part of the world, to the oriental part of the world. And therefore, there is a misfit between colonial frames of thinking and the way subaltern life world, subaltern collectives think. That is why this is a superimposition on the collective thinking, and therefore the political project of post-colonialism is how do we retrieve the organic subaltern ways of thinking and subvert and move away from colonial imposition in order to design our own social, institutional, cultural, political life. So this is a fairly attractive project, right? To give a call to move away from Western imposition. But 30, 40 years after the project, today you have a global right-wing nationalist regimes all over the world. Look at Turkey, look at United States. They are all talking this language of civilization. They are all talking the language of return to the roots of civilizational roots. They are all talking the language of authentic population. They are all talking the language of centrality of community over associational life. They are all talking the language of culture over associational modern institutional life. They all are privileging some modes of pre-modern modes of thinking, pre-modern modes of living. So ancient India had a more harmonious living. Modern India is fraught with conflicts. So the Hindu nationalist project is also about return to the roots. Post-colonial project is also looks somewhat return to the roots. So are these very similar projects? Did post-colonial theory also lay the path for rise of global cultural populism? Meerananda's recent book, I don't know if some of you have heard of Meerananda's recent book, makes a very unqualified connect between post-colonial theory and Hindu nationalism. She in fact makes a very strong claim that post-colonial theory globally offered the language necessary for the rise of Hindu nationalism. It's a very, very strong claim. So she is in a sense arguing that much of post-colonial scholars, their imagination of what is organic, indigenous, local, cultural is actually about certain dominant Hindu sensibilities. She did not add most of them are Bengali Bhadraloks. She was generous enough to say Hindu, but they're actually Hindu Bengali Bhadralok imagination, which is dominant Vedic Hinduism. So I will read out a couple of quotes from her to make you know what she says. I've just started, I've read a couple of chapters in her book, and in her introduction, Meerananda says that post-colonial theory has a distinctly Hindu sensibility, constitutes the political unconscious of Indian post-colonial theorists. The non-modern traditions in whose name they confront modernity, they confront colonial modernity, are all distinctly Hindu. She further goes on to say both, that is Hindu nationalists and post-colonial theorists, both want an India that proudly embraces its indigenous cultural norms and an India that boldly confronts the West with alternative universe of Indian provenance. Both direct their ire at Eurocentric conceptual categories for preventing the full flowering of India's native genius. Both seek to decolonize and indigenize science and social theory. Both sides are singing the same song with the same refrain, down with Eurocentrism, decolonize now, Swaraj in ideas. Place post-colonialism in the larger context of civilizational populism that has come to define contemporary Indian politics. So this is the direct connect that Mirananda is suggesting, that the basic social imaginary of post-colonial theorists and the basic imaginary of Hindu nationalist project, she says, not only is there convergence, but post-colonial theory has offered Hindu nationalists a ready-made language which they are able to readily co-opt. Language of indigeneity, language of questioning constitutionalism as being external document, language of rights being competitive, language of equality not belonging here, but it is not equality but samrastha. It is not about equal dignity, but it is about social harmony. So there seems to be some kind of uncanny convergence between these two theories. That is Mirananda's claim. But what I wish to do is that I think it would be too simplistic. I think Mirananda's reading seems to be slightly reductive in its content to quickly collapse post-colonial theories, Hindu sensibilities with that of. This leads us to very complex questions of what is being invoked as Hindu in this context. I think that's a very, very important question we need to raise. I think in one important sense, both post-colonial theories and current Hindu nationalists are referring to Hindu not as an organized religion like Abrahamic religions, but as a way of life. As Hindutva also says, Hindutva is a way of life. Hinduism as a way of life. That's why RSS says everybody who is born here is a Hindu. It's not a religious category, but it's a cultural category. I think post-colonial scholars also use this Hindu, though they do not invoke Hindu as a category, but when they talk of way of life, what is the dominant way of life they have in mind? I think this is an extremely important question for the current times, that, how do we decode? I think one of the reasons why counter movements, whether it is Dalit Bahujan struggles, whether it is left struggles, whether it is, centrist politics are struggling in India to gain a ground back, is partly because this understanding of the idea of way of life looks fairly universal. It looks fairly accommodative. It looks fairly integrating. It looks like it has a capacity to integrate everyone. It looks as if it is not an hegemonic project, which is precisely the sense in which post-colonial scholars invoke the idea of way of life. That it has such large cultural traits that everybody who is born here, cutting across castes, cutting across religions, can have certain common cultural heritage. In fact, this is also the argument that Romila Thapar makes in her recent book on culture as a heritage. Culture, by definition, means a certain common social practices that belong to a certain geographical area in certain time and space. So that can be in one sense referred to as civilizational. Civilization is also a category Romila Thapar invokes again and again. So there's a long enduring memory of how civilizations evolve, what has been the basic cultural ethos. Since it is such a long enduring, such a long cultural historical memory that is common, that is being stated. So that's why RSS says that when they talk of Hindu, it is not religion, but it also includes the Muslims, it also includes Christians. So anybody born in this geographical time and space is a Hindu. So Hindu is a cultural way of life. Now what is that cultural way of life? They say that there are certain common cultural modes of thinking. So they're raising an important question. When I was last year as at a talk by Sai Deepak when he came to JNU, I don't know whether Jeet you attended. Jeet attends only left scholars. He doesn't attend what others are saying. I went to listen to him and he raised a very important question. He said, what is an explanation that a movie like Kantara is a big success in the south, a big success in the north, is a big success in the northeast? In fact, I was in Kolkata, in Kharagpur, presenting this in Bengal. Somebody in the audience informed me that it was not only a great success in Northeast, but it was a big success in Spain. So cinema is another, Zizek argues, cinema is another cultural medium which we need to study to understand this recent phenomenon of why South Indian movies are becoming big hits in North India. We can take pride as South Indians, and you can all guys can feel proud over the Gangetic plains. But that's not the purpose. The purpose is to give an explanation. What can possibly explain that a movie about Kantara, about a remote village and a folklore practice of somebody being possessed, becomes such a big success in the north, becomes success in the cities, becomes success in the northeastern part of India? Does this provide sufficient evidence to say that there is something common in terms of certain cultural ethos which is fairly abstract, which can be fairly be part of our memory, which is not readily visible, but we all imbibe. And that's why when Hindu nationalists refer to certain civilizational, Indic civilizational practice, it quickly resonates with common people. Why is it that today, the moment Hindu nationalists refer to Hindu mobilization, that idea of Hindu as a cultural mobilization is cutting across castes? Backward castes are at the forefront of this Hindu mobilization. Tribals today are at the forefront. The moment RSS enters, one can call it hegemonizing. Recently I was in Tripura. And precisely for this reason, this is where the Tripura tribal students gifted me this shirt. So I thought I should wear it talking about indigeneity. Otherwise somebody might question I am too Eurocentric. So I have evidence that I am not Eurocentric. So through indigeneity, they took me, I traveled to certain remote parts to precisely understand this question. And wherever I traveled, Santal tribals are building Krishna temples. They are saying we are dissidents of Krishna. I said, you are dissidents of Komaram Bhim, it makes sense. What is the point in saying? He is saying Komaram Bhim is one small subset, but we are part of a larger pantheon of Hindu. So they said we also worship cow and Krishna symbolizes cow. I don't think all this is coming only through forceful imposition. So I asked them, are you being forced? Are you being incentivized? Is somebody offering you money? They said no. The information reaches us, but we are voluntarily, we believe that we are part of a larger. So we'll have to understand this changing ethic, why tribals who remain, they do not want to remain in remote areas. As market and technology are integrating, we also want an integrative cultural language. And the important point is that tribals no longer feel imposition or introduction of Hindu cultural symbolism is not an imposition. They are not feeling they are being hegemonized. They are not feeling their culture is being undermined. So I inquired about what happened to your deities. They said Santal had deities, they have our own deities, but we now are forgetting them. They are not relevant. We have Bengali priests who come and do Bengali ceremonies. So those of you from Northeast will know this. In Agartala this is happening, where even as a cultural and an economic conflict is going on of Bengali imposition on tribals, in spite of that there is an appeal to Hindu assimilation. Now is this assimilation, is this integration, is this colonization? I don't think it's an easy answer quickly to say that all this is imposition and you need ready opposition from tribals. That is not happening. I think that is the strength of Hindu nationalist project. So this is where we have to now re-enter post-colonial scholarship. That post-colonial scholars have also alerted us to this fact that there are certain cultural sensibilities that exist which are unique to this land. So should we say that post-colonial scholars alerted us to an alternative possibility of reading outside modern categories? Would that be a better way of reading post-colonial intervention, rather than arguing the Meera-Nanda way that post-colonial scholars paved the way for Hindu nationalist resurgence. By invoking categories of community and collective interests, like many of them argue, like Dipesh argues in Rethinking Working Class, that interest, the idea of interest is not at the center of class formation in the post-colonial societies. That is his claim. But classes in class formation in India takes through the idea of collective solidarity and collective interest rather than around question of interest. It takes shape around the question of preserving the idea of the collective. In one sense, this is also the Gandhian notion of struggle. What was the unique to Gandhian idea of third way? That he rejected both socialist and the capitalist way. He rejected the capitalist state-induced individualist way and the communist state-induced mechanisms. He said that we'll have to generate modes of resistance and protest without losing the collective sensibility that already exists. That is precisely the sense he gave through his metaphorical use of idea of Ramarajya, which he imagined exists in the village. It's a different matter, he never visited any village in his life. He imagined that is, so in one sense it's a very metaphysical use. It's not a very literal use. If you take a literal use, then you end up with what Dr. Ambedkar's response to Gandhi, that the villages are dense of ignorance, isolationism. I don't think Gandhi was referring, when he was talking of village republics or when he was talking of Ramarajya, to a literal idea of village, but a very metaphorical and a metaphysical idea of village or idea of Ramarajya, which meant that there is a collective sensibility that exists. There are collective modes of living we have. Therefore, Gandhi was one of the early post-colonial scholars who suggested that we should fight indignities of caste, we should fight inequalities, not through the modern liberal state apparatus, not through language of rights, not through the language of law, not through market and technology, but from within tradition. When he meant within tradition, of course, Gandhi uses this language of Varnashrama Dharma and so on and so forth. You should all read Akhil Bilgrami's piece on Gandhi and the vexed question of modernity. When he talks about this non-modern, fighting inequalities, fighting for recognition, fighting for dignity from within tradition, it meant that we should fight in a non-conflictual way, without disturbing the collective imagination that exists as a cultural practice, as a cultural imagination, because there are certain common cultural imaginations, cultural practices that exist across time and space, across castes, across even religions in this part of the world. So Gandhi was interested that we should harness that collective imagination in order to bring social change. And for him, his idea of non-violence meant to be invested in that common cultural practice, which can also be called common civilizational ethos. So if one were to make a fairer reading of post-colonial scholarship, I would avoid the Meera-Nanda way of saying that post-colonial scholarship paved the way to Hindu nationalists. Instead, can we make a reading where we can argue that post-colonial scholarship in India was one of the earliest scholars who alerted us to this fact, that even today people continue to think, this is Ashish Nandi's important contribution. If you read across his books, this is important contribution. What we are thinking ancient is not just ancient, but it continues to be the lived part of subaltern collective living in India. Therefore, in his argument against secularism, his critique is it's a state ideology. It doesn't work. But religion is not an ideology. Religion as faith, as everyday practice, continues to inform composite living cohabitation. Therefore, his grand claim that Indian villages never witness riots. Riots mostly happen in cities. So one variant of, there are many strands within post-colonial. I don't have the time to take you through. Each one of them have big differences. It's not that all of them can be lumped together, but this is their broad argument. Somebody like Ashish Nandi would say that this cultural, collective, civilizational imagination is very lived even today in India. And therefore, modern state market seems to disturb that collective living. Our project should be to retrieve that cultural cohabitation. We don't need modern state to teach us how to live together. We don't need modern laws. It is very Gandhian. We have enough communitarian practices. We have enough cultural practices. And of course, there are infirmities like caste, like untouchability, hierarchies. But all those should be fought by preserving that common cultural civilizational codes, not by disturbing them. What modernity does for Gandhi and post-colonial scholars is that in the name of equality, it destroys that basic cultural codes that allow us a collective imagination, a collective cohabitation. So that is the critique post-colonial scholars have presented, that they have alerted us that there is a strong resonance to this cultural, religious, civilizational language. We should use it and not go for the modern constitutional rights, institutional language. So those who alerted us first, can we blame them? It was therefore the first Hindu nationalist right-wing populism in India, which today is harnessing that language. So the success of Hindu nationalist project, or success of the Hindutva project that they are witnessing, is precisely because they use the language of community. They use the language of religion. They use the language of culture. They use the language of civilization. So the important question for us to decipher, we need to deconstruct this. This is a fairly complex terrain, is that what does the success of right-wing cultural populism signify vis-a-vis post-coloniality? Does it signify that the post-colonials were the first to alert us that this kind of a mobilization is possible, which can be counter-hegemonic to modernist constitutional project? Or should we learn a lesson on the other side that it is the mobilization around community and civilization which always carries the potential of becoming hegemonic, homogenizing, exclusionary? And that is why we need a modernist critique of both Hindu nationalist project as well as post-colonial theory. I hope I'm fairly clear in what I'm saying, that there are two possibilities that emerge. One way of reading is to say post-colonial, to those who are sympathetic could say that post-colonial scholars have alerted us of this possibility. Ashish Nandi was right when he said that there is an organic linkage, there is an organic cultural ethos, there is a composite cultural ethos. You don't need constitutional, modern institutional language. Success of Hindu nationalist project is precisely success of what Ashish Nandi signified. That is one mode of interpreting. The other mode of interpreting is the modernist critique, like Meerananda's intervention. Meerananda is a bit trite, but even otherwise one can argue that it is precisely the mobilization, any mobilization that is based on the language of community, culture and civilization always is bound to become homogenized, thereby hegemonic, thereby exclusionary. And I think this is a great epistemic question that is confronting us in today's modern contemporary politics. One of the reasons left politics, secular politics are struggling is we do not know how to wriggle out of this. Therefore, post-colonial scholarship becomes important. At the same time, I think the post-colonial scholarship also demonstrates a deep limitation in understanding what is required for post-colonial conditions. Let's assume hypothetically for a minute that what post-colonial scholars signified is correct in terms of taking recourse to community, religion, culture and civilization is an effective way of social mobilization. But can they deny that today precisely that is what Hindu nationalists are doing, and we have ended up where we have ended up because of a recourse to that kind of mobilization? That any mobilization in the name of community is bound to get hegemonic, is bound to talk about the language of authentic people. Once you talk about the nature of authentic people, then who is this authentic? The question of the people, which is at the heart of populist idea, cutting across castes, cutting across religion, cutting across class. That is why populism is such a huge phenomenon, that it questions all our conventional social science mode of dealing with power. Conventional social science is all about locating process through caste locationality, religious locationality, class locationality, ethnic locationality. But populism is for the first time a phenomenon which happened in the past but of a different velocity in today's context, is that it is able to mobilize people cutting across all these social locationalities. Which is precisely what the post-colonial scholars suggest. So when subaltern scholars write about collective mentalities, if you read Ranajit Guha, this is the language they use, collective mentalities. It precisely means this, that subaltern locationality gives you, beyond their immediate locationality, there is a collective modes in which, cultural modes in which subalterns think, which are anti-modern, which question Eurocentrism, so this is the confusing, slippery ground on which we are today. If you acknowledge and go the right-wing way, which is also the way post-colonial theory will take us, is to acknowledge these. So can we imagine a possibility where you can invoke categories of community, culture, religion and civilization, but yet that project remains democratic in essence, inclusive in essence, egalitarian in essence? Is that a real-time possibility? Can constitutional language, what Dr. Ambedkar suggested, can the language of constitutional morality and the language of community and culture, can they ever go together? Can the language of constitutionalism and the language of civilizational, can you see them converging? Is there a possibility that they can go together? Or, as modern social scientists, as modernists suggest, these are run by completely different kinds of ethos and ethics. You can never conflict civilizational ethic with constitutional ethic. Constitutionalism talks about equality in very different registers. That is not at the concern, center of the concern of civilizational language. That is not at the center of concern of cultural. What is the central difference? The central difference is, if you want me to put it in a basal way, I could argue that modernist project is located in terms of growing recognition of social differences. That is the egalitarian essence of modernity. It is all about recognizing particularities. Modernity is all about driving in terms of recognizing more and more particularities. Each identity has its specificity. Each identity has its specific cultural ethos. Each identity has its specific lifestyles. Each identity has its specificity. So modernity finds question of equality and dignity in recognizing this specificity. in recognizing and privileging this difference. Non-modern, pre-modern, traditional civilizational language lays emphasis not on difference, but on commonality. What modernists argue is that that commonality, that sense of universality, enlightenment talks about, invariably belongs to the dominant social groups. It is the dominant social groups who claim their culture and their way of life and their way of being as the universal way of being. Like in Indian context, it is a Vedic Hinduism, you can call it Brahmanical Hinduism. That becomes by default the universal mode of living that everybody gets co-opted it. Like the campaigns on vegetarianism today. Imagine Jeet not being able to eat fish. Traumatic for Bengalis. That becomes by default cultural universalism. Hindus do not eat non-vegetarian food. So, a trait of minority section of society, maybe South Indian Tamil Brahmins, becomes the universal imposition on all other cultural traits of all other social groups. So this is an example of how the idea of civilization, commonality works, while modernity says because to avoid that imposition only way is that proliferation of social differentiation. We should have more and more. That is the whole theory of recognition from Hegel to Axel Honneth. The dignity lies in recognition. What is recognition? Recognition of more and more human traits, more and more social practices that need to be recognized as civil. So it is an expansion of differences, there is inclusion. There is an inclusion which is egalitarian. The inclusion of the non-modern universality and commonality is hierarchical inclusion. So this is again to translate into an empirical sociological question is that will tribals in India be better integrated as common Hindu, or will tribals be better integrated through their recognition of their individual tribes' cultural practices, food habits, modes of thinking, so on and so forth. Post-colonial scholarship thought that there is some kind of a unicorn alliance possible, that we can draw some modern ethics. That's why they talk about alternative modernities. Partha Chatterjee talks about our modernity. I think that has been a misplaced reading by post-colonial scholarship. What I do in my own arguments is that if you look at the tradition-modernity debate, much of post-colonial scholars thought that India has achieved certain kind of a very unique dialectical integration between modernity and tradition. We have preserved certain traditional aspects and included certain good aspects of modernity. And that's why India is a functional, successful democracy. This is the argument that cuts across post-colonial, Rudolph's, so on and so forth. But what we are witnessing today, I think, is that that tradition-modernity nexus has been a very hegemonic nexus in the post-colonial societies. Tradition resisted modernity and capitalism for wrong reasons. Post-colonial scholarship felt that everything that comes from tradition is a resistance of market, resistance of modernity, and resistance of capital. Today, what is happening is there is an unholy nexus between the hierarchies within tradition and new inequalities that is created by modernity and capitalism. That is why Hindutva is a corporate Hindutva. that the new corporate capital needs exactly the kind of inequalities that already exist in tradition. Gender inequalities, caste inequalities, and class inequalities. Tradition today is providing the fulcrum for the necessities of late capitalism, financial capitalism, and new global corporate capitalism. I don't think post-colonial scholarship is in a position to address this question sufficiently. And that is where one can argue there is a default convergence, an uncanny double between post. So I would refrain from using Mirananda kind of a direct convergence between post-coloniality and Hindu nationalist project, but I would argue there is a new structural condition in which the inability of post-colonial scholarship to see this possibility of convergence between tradition and modernity, modern capitalism, need for inequalities and reinforcement of hierarchies in traditional modes of life, that is the convergence which is helping Hindu nationalist project. And that is the convergence which I don't think post-colonial or decolonial scholarship is able to sufficiently explain. You will be able to understand that many of, therefore, the propositions that post-colonial scholarship makes, they actually flow in very different direction on the ground. Take one concrete proposition that how do you retrieve pre-modern traditions outside modernity? What is one standard strategy that all post-colonial scholars offer you? They say return to the vernacular. If you read Partha Chatterjee's essay, Vernacular Political Science, you should all read that essay, a very fine essay, where Chatterjee is arguing that one way to build Indian political theory is we should move away from English-based text to reading vernacular text, to following everyday colloquial communication between common people. Therefore, for instance, in this article, he picks up the category of Desh. And he says that if you follow a genealogy of this concept of Desh, he says it has very different meanings in different parts of the world. In Bengal, Desh means para, locality. In Odia, he says Desh means region. Nowhere Desh means nation state. So he says, Partha Chatterjee's suggestion is that if you pick up colloquial usage and convert them, then we need to convert them into political theoretical concepts. That is when he says we can counter Eurocentric Western political theory, and that is where we have to launch Indian political theory. Therefore, broad suggestion of post-colonial scholarship is return to vernacular language and return to mother tongue. Now look at the interesting part, how it crisscrosses the current moment where post-colonial scholars are suggesting return to mother tongue just when Dalit Bahujan politics are demanding English education. This is how social power gets reconstituted. That is why post-colonial scholars are one step outside. They're not one step outside modernity, they're one step outside reality. Especially the Bhadralok scholarship. I don't think Bangya will agree fully, he's part of them with subaltern scholars, but this is part of my problem with post-colonial scholarship. You have to zero it down to the concrete, and then you will get the essence of where they misdirect, put it in Foucauldian language, it's a kind of a misdirection. Post-colonial scholarship's return to mother tongue comes from this understanding of unearthing colloquial organic concepts that are in usage between communities, within community, and therefore to understand communitarian sensibilities, you'll have to understand colloquial. Therefore, they're all great champions of mother tongue. My question would be a more structural question. Why does post-colonial scholarship make this argument just when Dalit Bahujan politics is demanding English education? That's one. Two, why does post-colonial scholarship sound like Home Minister Amit Shah? He's also saying that speaking in English, you will feel insulted in this country to speak in in English. Third, does regional language, does the vernacular offer us a ready site of resistance? This is the imagination behind post-colonial scholarship. That return to the vernacular is a ready site of resistance to modernity and capitalism. I have my serious doubts. I would contrarily argue that vernacular language is like English language. Why does post-colonial scholarship reject English? It rejects English for some good reasons. That it is part of global capital. English comes with imposition of certain Western, what Sudipto Kaviraj called imperialism of categories. It's a fair point. But should the same question not be extended to the vernacular? Is vernacular not bereft of caste locationalities, caste power configuration? If you take Telugu language, there is a conflict between literary Telugu and colloquial Telugu. Vernacular itself is fraught with caste conflicts. All those anti-caste movements have rebelled against, not just, they have rebelled against vernacular Telugu and accepted English. Post-colonial scholars are asking us to return to vernacular and reject English. Recently we had a conference in Delhi where Sudipto was there, and I made this point, and I was later told he was very disturbed with this argument that we are referring to vernacular as casteist languages. That they are casteist, whether they have their history, all those things can be historically questioned, but one has to ascribe and explain the aspirational momentum among Dalit Bahujan scholars for English. So, today Dalit Bahujan scholars wanting to learn English, I don't think is a colonial relic. English has become an economic infrastructure today rather than a colonial relic. I think there's a big shift in this. Social and cultural practices do not remain frozen in time and space. If you look at history, who brought English first? It was the Brahmins and Kayas who learnt English, were the first Macaulay's children. They were the ones who learnt English first. They became Babus, of course, Bengal leading the way. Bengalis are both first Babus and first revolutionaries. They do both. They first learn English, they were the first one to preach mother tongue. So there's something in the social configuration that we need to question. So language is one concrete question where you can make this point that, if you remember 1950s, how the change has come. 1950 colonial period, it's the Brahmins and Kayas who learnt English first, and it was Lohia who said Angrezi Hatao movement. Subalterns rejected English. 2000, it is Dalit Bahujans who are demanding English. It is upper caste Brahmins and Kayas who are saying English Hatao, bring back mother tongue. Look at how things have turned on their head. So social configuration of power keeps changing. Therefore, certain propositions of post-colonial theory that were made in certain time and space are acting out very differently. Critical theorist Nancy Fraser talks about this as uncanny double. We did it in critical theory course. She says in history, there's always an uncanny double, that certain practices turn on their head and they begin to do something else from how they were initially imagined. So post-colonial scholars may have imagined return to vernacular as questioning colonial modernity and capitalism, but what it does today, 40, 50 years down the line, is that it becomes that kind of an arguments get engulfed. Again, you can see this uncanny convergence between Hindu nationalist rejection of English and post-colonial. How do you explain it? It might be coming from different imaginations. So it was the first post-colonial scholars who gave this call for return to the vernacular. Today Hindu nationalists are precisely making this argument, go back to mother tongues, leave English. And we know the political reason why Hindu nationalists wish to reject English and want to push mother tongue is precisely to restrict the social and economic mobility of Dalits and Bahujans in this country. I think there's complete clarity on that front. As far as I'm concerned, there's complete clarity. Of course, post-colonial scholars might have said for a different reason, all that, but we are here to explain the convergence. That why did this formulation lead to a completely different outcome, and today it is helping Hindu nationalist project. So I will conclude by arguing that we need to, one, avoid, I think, Meera Nanda kind of interpretation that, post-colonial scholars exclusively have framed the way for Hindu nationalist project. I don't think that would be a correct reading of Hindu nationalist, rise of Hindu nationalism. But that leaves us with n number of questions. Some of the questions that I framed here, that the limitations in post-colonial scholarship is something that we need to return to. This project of Indian knowledge system, indigeneity, Indian political theory is fraught with a lot of these questions. This idea of bringing in Oriental post-colonial community categories in order to reject Eurocentrism. I would take more the Amartya Sen kind of line. In both his book, Identity in Violence and Idea of Justice, he makes the argument that across globe, different social locationalities and different countries are together, are thinking in their own time and space about questions of dignity, rights, recognition, humiliation. I see a greater possibility in trans-cultural, transnational dialogue rather than putting our eggs in the basket of the post-colonial, decolonial kind where we imagine that our categories are completely incommensurate with global experience. That European categories will have nothing to do with Indian experience. That this incommensurability that decoloniality wishes to project, I think is a project that we need to really avoid. That I don't think, because these categories that we have themselves need to be interrogated, even as we interrogate European categories. Borrowing European categories does not mean impose. What we reject is the imposition, hegemonic aspect, not the categories itself. Because there is always a transvaluation that happens when these categories travel. We don't just take them as they exist. I think they undergo transmorphication, but they transform in their modalities. So I think in this dialogue that we get more in, especially in hierarchical societies like India. And Europe has already learnt from Oriental societies. If you read Sanjay Subramaniam's Integrated Connected Histories, you'll see that Europe has always been learning from Oriental societies. So I think we should move more towards, even Amartya Sen's title of his autobiography is Home in the World. That you feel at home in the world. Rather than talking about indigeneity and decolonization in terms of such deep, incommensurate way. Of course, there are nuances to this. If you read Sudipto Kaviraj's essay, What is Western in Western Political Theory, he makes this point that there are three levels of generality. That there is one level of generality which is comparable, another level of generality where there is tension and give and take, and then he says there is a third local, the idea of the local, which is completely incommensurate to the Western experience, and that is when Western categories begin to become hegemonic and imperialistic in their character. We can get into some of those details. But I think we should be extremely cautious in terms of this incommensurable idea, that Western and Eastern are so incommensurate that no dialogue is possible. Decoloniality has such unique terms, which I think also translates as a critique into identity politics. So I would also extend that critique to Dalit Bahujan politics, which talk about unique lived experience, that where non-Dalits cannot talk on behalf of Dalits. I think that ethical worldview also extends. into a critique of the Dalit Bahujan of a different kind. So we come a full circle. If you can see the connections, we actually come a full circle that we should not, in the process of questioning, in my writings, I argue in the process of questioning imperialism of categories, we should not end up with fundamentalism of experience. Today, the global conflict is between fundamentalism and imperialism. In a very metaphorical sense, I'm arguing. And the same conflict is here, that we can question what post-colonial and decolonial theory does is in the process of questioning imperialism of categories, it extends fundamentalism of experience. That lived experience of social groups again are so incommensurate. So one, we have incommensurability between the East and West. That incommensurability also extends within East. The lived experience cannot be articulated by non-Dalits. Ambedkar belongs only to Dalits. I think this is a different kind of a fragmentation than that what modernity brings. Modernity's fragmentation is a dialogic fragmentation. This nature of fragmentation, of incommensurability, I would conclude by arguing, is very much acceptable to global capital. That is where we'll have to be extremely cautious, even when we talk of differences, how we are projecting and theorizing those differences matters a lot. I'll stop here and thank all of you again for this patient hearing.
Okay, so we'll open the floor for Q&A. So